What's up, guys? Mr. Castro again. Let's take a look at Chapter 10. So, launching the new ship of state, right? So, actually looking at the government. So, the government takes, its hold in 1789. And so, we're going to look all the way up into 1800, which is the election of Thomas Jefferson. So, we're going to take a look at the actual presidencies of President Washington and John Adams. So, a couple things. 1790, the population began doubling every 25 years. Cities were growing, but still, even then, 90% of the population was still very rural. Only 5% west of the Appalachian Mountains. Most of the people lived in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. 1791, Vermont becomes the 14th state. I always say that it's easy to remember Vermont versus New Hampshire because Vermont kind of has a V shape, right? People always confuse the two. A couple of things, right? The revolution and problems under the articles eroded respect for authority. So again, just again, it's like I was telling you guys. It's how does the coach get the kids so fired up to play in the game, right? But then still be able to control them after. So they had essentially built this idea that revolution was okay, and then plus the Articles of Confederation were so weak, right? That again, the new Constitution was supposed to solve these answers. Along the frontier is where we found most of the less loyal people, right? Because again, they were farther away from the country, also having to deal with Spain, right, and the Mississippi. But we'll come back to that. The government began operating on very little revenue, and that's again, it's just following the Revolutionary War, right? There's not a lot of money, huge public debt, little metallic money, so not a lot of gold and silver. Many had regarded the creation of a huge republic as impossible, right? Many of the monarchs were afraid of success. They were afraid that, especially like King Louis, right? Like, oh my God, if this actually succeeds, what does that mean for us? And monarchs around Europe, too. And again, part of what the Federalist Papers were for were to convince the people in our own country, specifically New York, that this could actually work, that this bold experiment could work. So 1789, President Washington, right? He is unanimously elected president by the Electoral College. I'll show you guys a clip from John Adams where this happened. The triumphal procession from Mount Vernon to New York City took the oath on April 30th, 1789, balcony overlooking Wall Street. And again, we'll take a look at that. And again, today the president is actually inaugurated in January and not in April. So one of the very first things President Washington did is he established a cabinet. There is nothing in the Constitution that says that the president can do this or that it's allowed or anything like that, right? So he was smart enough to figure, you know what, I'm not smart enough for this job. So what he did is he actually created this cabinet, right? So secretaries. And so the three big ones, right, was the three big ones in terms of departments, right, were the Department of State, right? The Department of State's job is to deal with other countries. Excuse me. The Department of the Treasury, right, whose job it was to deal with money or the economy. The Secretary of War, right, or the Department of War, which today is actually the Department of Defense and Secretary of Defense. And really interesting, right? The people that he picks. So Secretary of War, he picks one of his mates from the war, a guy by the name of Henry Knox. The Secretary of the Treasury is this really young, up-and-coming politician from New York, right, who's actually born down in the West Indies, a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton. And then, coming back from France, right, was Thomas Jefferson. And he asks Jefferson comes back in, right, and he's like, oh, look at me, I was like an adopted son to Washington, right? He comes in and he realizes that Washington's favor is on Hamilton, and so Jefferson's a little jealous of Hamilton from the get-go. And we'll watch a scene from John Adams, too, where this takes place, where they begin arguing with each other. Many states had ratified the Constitution on grounds that the Bill of Rights would be added. And again, we had talked about that, right? States like Massachusetts had said, you know what, we will ratify the Constitution, but you need to provide a Bill of Rights. So James Madison, who's also known as Father of the Constitution, he's also the father of the Bill of Rights. He is the one that wrote down the Bill of Rights. So he drafted these amendments. There were many, but 10 were approved. And so in 1791, these 10 amendments get added to the Constitution. So 1791, right, like I said, the first 10 amendments are adopted by the required number of states, included basic freedoms, right, like freedom of religion, speech, press, right, the right to bear arms, trial by jury, assembly, petition government for grievances. And one of the things that we'll do in classes, we'll take a closer look at each one of them. And again, so just the list here, right? But Amendment number 1, freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. So a lot of times, Amendment number 1 is called the freedom of expression amendment, right? Because all of these are ways to express yourself. Amendment number 2, the right to bear arms. This is a really interesting one right now, right? Especially with gun control. What did the founders mean by the right to bear arms and be able to have a militia? Amendment number 3, right? Soldiers can't be housed in civilian homes during peacetime, right? So again, just taking a look at the Quartering Act. Amendment number 4, right to refuse to speak during a civil trial, no double jeopardy. So here we have the Bill of Rights, right? Just taking a look at it, the individual ones. You'll notice though that I did make a mistake. I forgot to add one of them in here. This is actually number 5. Okay, and I forgot number 4, so we'll talk about number 4 in just a second. So amendment number 1 is freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. A lot of times this is called the freedom of expression amendment because all of these are forms of expression. Amendment number 2, the right to bear arms. We'll talk a little bit about it also, right, because especially with all the gun control stuff that's going on. Amendment number 3, right, is very much in reference to the Quartering Act. So again, soldiers can't be housed in civilian homes during peacetime. Amendment number 4, which is the one that I forgot, is the illegal searches and seizures, right? So, and this is in response to the writs of assistance, and again, we'll talk about it. Amendment number 5, the right to refuse to speak during a civil trial, no double jeopardy, property, right? So again, government cannot take your property without due process. So this is pretty much called the Due Process Amendment. And again, we'll take a look at specific examples in class. Amendment number 6, the right to a speedy trial and public trial. Amendment number 7, the right to trial by jury when the sum exceeds $20. You may ask yourself, well, $20? Well, that's a lot of money back then. Amendment number 8, no excessive bails, fines, and or fees, no cruel and unusual punishment. And 2 that are really important, right? Amendment number 9, other rights not enumerated are also in effect. So this is known as the People's Rights Amendment, and the reason why is because it basically says there's no way I could have listed every single thing, and so number 9 means that if it's even though it's not listed, it's still a right. And then amendment number 10, which is going to become very synonymous with like things like the Civil War, is known as the States' Rights Amendment. So number 10 is the Federalism Amendment, right? So we talked about federalism and how you have this cake again in the previous chapter, right? And so what it says, if it's not a federal law, then the states have the right to make a law, and so then every local government within the state has to follow it, right? So again, amendment number 10. So for example, when it comes to slavery, there was no federal law regarding whether slaves were okay or not, and so the states, right, had said that they could do it. And that's going to become a very critical issue as we move forward towards the Civil War. So one of the very first things that Washington has to deal with is the fact that the country is a mess when it comes to the economy. So what he did is he basically says to Alexander Hamilton, hey, congratulations, Hamilton, you are the new Secretary of the Treasury. Oh, by the way, we have debt, and I need you to fix it. Luckily for Washington, he was very brilliant when it came to the economy. So he developed a plan which would help the economy, right? Help the wealthy, who will help the government. Prosperity will trickle down to the masses. So the idea was that we needed to put the country's debt, the country's economic feasibility in the hands of the wealthiest of Americans. And the reason why that made sense, according to Hamilton, was because if the country's debt, or the economy, the future of the economy of the United States was in the hands of the wealthiest Americans, they would want to make sure that it succeeds. Today, the United States, right, part of our debt, 50% of our debt approximately, which is in the form of bonds, is actually owned by Chinese bankers, right? So think about this, right? There's this whole thing about, does China want to blow us up, right? Is China still the enemy? Think about this. 50% of the United States debt is owned by Chinese bankers, right? They want to get those bonds paid back. Do you really think those Chinese bankers, who have a lot of power in China, are going to allow anything to happen in the United States? Probably not, right? So that was Hamilton's argument, that if we put the money in the hands of the wealthiest Americans, right, or the debt, right, in the form of bonds, then, and I'll explain what that means in a second. What'll happen is, right, that these wealthy Americans would want to make sure that the country succeeds. It was good because you could actually get international debt, right? Or credit to me by having international bankers also own some of that debt. So it would help bolster U.S. credit. So he urged the U.S. government to pay its debts of $54 million at face value, what's called at par, as well as assuming the debt of the states, which was about $21.5 million. So realistically, the country's debt was roughly $80 million at the end of the American Revolution. Could you imagine today, right, where every year we're adding $1 trillion to the debt? He urged Congress to assume the debts of states, as debt was to pay for war. Assumption would chain the states to the Union and attach wealthy creditors to federal government. Again, I'll go over this in class so you guys can see the visual. But a lot of the states didn't like this. So, like, for example, Virginia had no debts and Massachusetts had the most debt. So this created a dilemma, right? Because Virginia's going to say, well, wait a minute, we don't have any debt, so why should we assume as a state, right, all of this national debt, right? And according to Hamilton, it would help keep the country together. So again, according to Hamilton, right, we have essentially, we look at debt, okay? So the debt of the country, and again, I'm rounding, right? So the debt of the country is approximately $80 million, okay? So Hamilton basically says in his, what's called the assumption plan, right? I know, ass plan, you guys are all like little Beavis and Buttheads, right? So the assumption plan, the idea was to assume all the debt. That's what the federal government was going to do. So Hamilton believed that the way to pay for this was in three ways, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about this in just a second also. And again, we'll go over this in class again, but I just want to introduce it to you. So he believed that there were three ways to pay for this, okay? First, he said one of the ways to pay for this was through a tariff, right? So having a tariff. So again, part of what we want to do with the tariff is we want to help increase American industry. Because what the tariff would do is it would actually raise the prices, right, on goods coming in. And so hopefully people would buy American manufactured goods. But the other thing, too, is the tariff would actually generate revenue for the federal government, right? That revenue would hopefully pay off some of that debt. Another way to pay for this would be through an excise tax. Oops, I misspelled it. Sorry. Excise tax. Okay? What an excise tax is a tax on something that is considered an excess, right? So we don't need it. For example, today, cigarettes have an excise tax, right? Nobody needs it. There's no benefit from it, right? Nobody has to have cigarettes. Gasoline has an excise tax. So at the time, one of the very first things that was taxed was whiskey, because people were drinking a lot of whiskey, not just because they weren't just drinking whiskey because, to get drunk. They were drinking whiskey because it meant clean water, right? Because the whiskey was purified. So that would be another way to pay, right? Was to tax things that people didn't necessarily need, right? The other way is through what are called bond measures, right? So bonds. So bonds are a way for the government to borrow from people, right? So this is where the wealthiest Americans, along with wealthy international bankers, what they would do is they would receive a piece of paper, a bond, right? And so the way that it works is the government gives you a bond, right? So let's say that somebody buys a bond for $1,000, okay? So you receive a piece of paper from the government that says $1,000 U.S. savings bond, okay? Now, what you have given the government is $500, so you actually pay half. So you've just given the government $500, right? You lent them $500. Now, if the federal government collapsed within hours of you giving out this $500, you're screwed because you just gave $500, right? There's no government. So you want to make sure that the government actually succeeds, and here's why. Because what happens is the bond that you're holding on to, it matures. So after several years, right? Today it's about 10 years. What will happen is the bond will mature. So what you paid was $500, but because you lent the government that $500, they promised to not only pay you back the $500. So if you sold the bond within a month of getting it, it's still going to only be worth about $500, maybe $502, right? Because it's earning interest from the government. But if you let it mature, you would now have a bond that's worth $1,000. And even then, you can let the bond continue to mature if you wanted to, and you would earn more money. So essentially, what you're doing is you're paying the government money, and they're promised to pay you back with interest, right? Now, why is that important? The reason that's important is because think about who would be able to afford these bonds. It would be the wealthiest people, right? Now, if you're Hamilton, this makes sense. But there were a lot of people that distrusted this, especially the anti-federalists, right? People led by people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They were very wary of this because they were afraid that since all of the bankers, right, the majority of the country's wealth and money, manufacturers was in the North, that this assumption plan as a whole was benefiting northern bankers, northern businessmen, and that the southerners were going to be hurt by it because A, they're having to pay the tariff, and the reason why they're having to pay the tariff is because they're buying the manufactured goods. And again, we'll talk a little bit about this more in class. So there was a plan also in place to move the capital to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right? So this was the plan. So they're like, oh, let's move the capital to Pennsylvania. It makes sense in the middle colonies, right, or middle states. So the Southerners were not pleased. Not only were they not pleased with the fact that he was going to be moved to Philadelphia, but they weren't pleased with Alexander Hamilton's plan. Madison was very opposed to Hamilton's plan, right? So there was a lot of arguing going on in terms of what was happening. So Jefferson decides to throw a dinner party, okay, in New York. And he throws a dinner party for himself, Hamilton, and Jefferson. And what comes out of this dinner party is it's the Compromise of 1790, right? So compromise, which is what Congress is having a difficult time doing now, right? So this is what Jefferson proposed, that the Anti-Federalists would approve the Assumption Plan, that Madison and Jefferson would get the Anti-Federalists in Congress to approve the Assumption Plan, okay? However, with that being said, you would get the Southerners, right, to be able to do this if you moved the capital into the South. So what happened was they decided to take a little bit of land for Maryland. So Maryland gave up some land, Virginia gave up some land, and they created this place called Washington City, which today becomes known as Washington, D.C., right? Washington District of Columbia, which is in reference to Christopher Columbus. So they moved the capital south. Assumption is approved, okay? And this is the Compromise of 1790. Now, if you're Philadelphia, you're like, whoa, wait a minute here. Like, what just happened, right? So in order to say to Philadelphia, sorry, you kind of were like stuck out of the bargain, what they did is the main street in Washington, D.C. today, where the White House is located, is Pennsylvania Avenue. And that's why it's called Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, because funding at par assumption, government had huge debt, right? We talked about this. So Hamilton was not worried. So again, he felt like the best way to pay for it was the tariffs, the excise taxes, and the bonds. So again, this created suspicion from the Anti-Federalists, right? Because again, for a few reasons. A, like I said, they believed that the country's debt being in the hands of the wealthiest Americans, right, would essentially mean that it's in the hands of the North, and this whole assumption plan would benefit the North. What they also didn't like was the fact that there was nothing in the Constitution that said Hamilton could do this, right? And so they believe, because one of the things that he also proposes is, well, where are you going to put all this money? And one of the things that he's going to eventually say is, well, we're going to need to put this money in a bank, and we'll get to that in just a second. So the Anti-Federalists, they believed that there was nothing in the Constitution to give Hamilton the permission to do this. So they become slowly what are called strict constructionists. They believed in a strict construction. So whatever it says, right? So for example, if I have a rule in my class that says do not eat, and let's say somebody in class is diabetic and they go, Mr. Castro, I didn't take my insulin, can I have a Snickers? I'm going to say, I'm sorry, you're going to die. Hello? Right? That's strict constructionist, right? I'm not breaking the rule. I'm not bending at all. Now, a loose constructionist, which is what more of the Federalists are going to be, because the response from the Federalists is going to be, well, even though it doesn't say in the Constitution, it's implied. This is part of what's called the implied powers, that we can actually create laws that benefit the American people, okay? And so in the example of my classroom, right, if I was a loose constructionist, I'd say, you know what, yeah, I can bend this rule because you obviously need to eat. So in 1791, the first tariff law was passed, 8% tariff on imports. The goal was revenue and protection for new industries. Then in 1791, the first excise tax was placed on domestic items. So whiskey, for example, 7 cents was charged for every gallon, and that's going to be very huge, and we'll come back to it. So Hamilton proposed the question, where do we put the money? So he says, well, let's build a bank, right? And then we'll put all the money in the bank, and the bank will also provide sound currency. Well, again, the Anti-Federalists will come back and go, where is this in the Constitution? And so again, we have the strict versus loose constructionist argument, right? The Anti-Federalists, right? So the Anti-Federalists, they believe that since it doesn't say in the Constitution, you can't do it. The Federalists believed, well, it's part of the implied powers, right? So essentially that just because it's not in the Constitution, right, we can do what is called necessary and proper. So it's part of necessary and proper, right? That it's implied in the Constitution that, and it's actually a clause in the Constitution that the Congress has the right to do what's necessary and proper. So the bank was useful, but would it be constitutional, right? So Jefferson, the Constitution does not authorize the creation of a bank, that power reserved for the states, right? So this, again, develops this theory of strict construction, right? Strict construction is something that strict literal interpretation of the Constitution. The federal government can only do what is specifically allowed. Hamilton argued the government could not do what it was forbidden by the Constitution, could do whatever was not forbidden, right? So just, again, if it doesn't say it, we still can. So Hamilton used the necessary and proper clause, right, or the elastic clause of the Constitution, resulting in the implied powers to justify, right, this loose view. So it's also known as the broad interpretation of the Constitution. So Hamilton convinced Washington to his view, and Washington signed the bank into law. So the debate over the bank revealed a north-south split, right? Southerners were against the bank. The Northerners were in favor of it. Northerners were bankers and businessmen that would benefit from the investment in the bank, again, those bonds. Southerners were states' rights advocates that argued in favor of strict construction and distaste for Northern businessmen. And this also foreshadows something, right? That if you allow the government to begin making laws based on this loose constructionism, Southerners also begin thinking about the question of, well, what eventually happens with this question, right? Little foreshadowing. So the bank was created in 1791, and it is chartered for 20 years, okay? So it's set to expire in 1811. Then in 1794, very similar to what happened with Shays' Rebellion, there was a rebellion in Pennsylvania that challenges the new government. The reason for it is because these Pennsylvania whiskey distillers, these growers of whiskey, right, or the actual stuff that goes into whiskey. I actually had an AP student, by the way, a few years back who was like, how can you grow whiskey, right? She actually thought I meant like bottles from like bushes, right? So they were upset, and so they revolted in Pennsylvania. They said, we're not paying. So again, this begins to question the authority of the government, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, right, Massachusetts began taxing its farmers, right? So again, there was no federal army to go in and actually stop this rebellion, right? Massachusetts had to handle it. So what happened was this now questioned the authority of Washington. So when the Whiskey Rebellion happened in 1794, President Washington, right, Congress had made this law. It was approved by the states, one of the states being Pennsylvania. And now the citizens of Pennsylvania, right, so again, it raises this question of when the federal government makes a law, everyone has to follow it, right? Okay, so Washington raised the army, and the army was prepared to invade Pennsylvania, and so to put down this rebellion, to squash this rebellion, because it is the job of the executive to enforce the laws made by Congress. And since Congress had made this whiskey tax, right, it was his job to go in and enforce it. So what ends up happening is the army shows up, and the whiskey farmers all retreat. The Anti-Federalists look at this and go, this is an example of tyranny, right? Washington was behaving with too much authority. The Federalists are going to look at this and go, no, it's not, right? That's actually his job. His job is to make sure that people follow the laws. So the Whiskey Rebellion brings up an interesting point in terms of enforcement. So the revenue officers were tarred and feathered, collections halted, right? Washington summoned the militia but found no significant rebellion. Nobody died, right? But again, it just brings up this issue of rebellion, right? And a much different outcome from Shays' Rebellion. So Hamilton's success resulted in solid U.S. credit, but policies infringed on states' rights, right? We talked about that. Organized opposition began to build, right, by Jefferson and Madison, first in Congress, but flowed out to public via newspapers. The founders had not anticipated political parties, and in fact their existence in a democracy seemed disloyal. However, a two-party system has existed ever since, right, providing needed checks and majorities. So again, initially they did not want to call themselves parties because they didn't want to show that they were differences, right? They didn't want to show the American people that there were divisions, and so initially they were called factions. Then in 1789, right, that same year that Washington is elected president, the French Revolution breaks out. Okay, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded by the Jacobins. Americans, especially Jefferson, cheered the beginning of the French Revolution, right? Because they said, it's in the spirit of the American Revolution, right? People were sick of these monarchies. But what ends up happening is this results in what's called the Reign of Terror, right? Um, and the Reign of Terror was essentially a declaration of war on all of the monarchs of Europe, okay? The Federalists did not like the French Revolution because they were like, whoa, right? Like, this is an example of what happens when we allow mob mentality, right? So they were afraid that this mob mentality, right, that if we allowed this to go unchecked, right, that the American people would resemble, like, how long was it going to be before the American people would look at the United States government and say, well, we need to overthrow people, we need to behead people, right? And so they were really afraid, and they didn't want to support the French Revolution. Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists felt like they should support the Reign of Terror, right, or the attack on the monarchies, because this new French government, okay, they, according to Jefferson, right, they had signed this treaty with the United States after the Battle of Saratoga, and so the United States owed this French government, okay, the support against the monarchs of Europe. The Federalists are going to argue, well, wait a minute. No, the treaty that we signed was with King Louis XVI and not this new government, so therefore we do not have to support. So now the French Revolution becomes a key issue for the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists in terms of support versus not support. So the Franco-American Alliance, 1778, was still in effect, right, bound the U.S., but again, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans favored honoring the alliance. However, Washington knew the U.S. was weak militarily and economically, and the war needed to be avoided. So in 1793, without Congress, he issues a neutrality of proclamation, or a proclamation of neutrality, right? Basically saying that the United States is not going to get involved. The proclamation warned the citizens to be impartial. There was a Frenchman by the name, he becomes known as Citizen Genet. He arrived from France to Charleston Harbor, and he started promoting the alliance, and Washington actually kicked his ass out. And so France recalled him. Again, a picture of Citizen Genet. So the British made neutrality difficult, maintained trading posts on U.S. soil, sold firearms to Indians, collaborated with the Indians to check U.S. expansion to the frontier, so they began instigating, okay? So from Canada, while this is all happening, the English continue to support and supply the natives along the frontier with weapons. They also expected the Americans to defend the French West Indies, right? So the British began to attack U.S. merchant ships, and they began seizing the ships, and they began something called impressment. So this is in the Atlantic Ocean. So what impressment is actually when the British began boarding the ships and taking the people from the ships and making them part of the Royal Navy. So they were not only seizing the American ships, but they were seizing the sailors and forcing them to enlist in the Royal Navy. So Jefferson called for a war with the British. He said, we need to go back to war with England because of what they're doing, right? Not only are they instigating the Native Americans along the frontier, but they are seizing and impressing our sailors, right? The Federalists resisted. And the Federalists were like, oh, heck no, right? Because, again, our biggest trade partner at the time was England. So if England continues to buy our stuff, and if England, right, which is pretty funny, right, because, again, we just fought a war with them. But, again, if your enemy, somebody who was your enemy, owns a pair of shoes that you want to buy, and they're the only person you can buy those shoes from, guess what? Your enemy has just become a friend for a while. So the British, they were selling their goods in the United States, which was bringing in revenue, which was also helping the Assumption Plan, right? So the United States is caught, right, between these two things. We're trading with France. We're trading with England. The French are attacking our ships in the Atlantic because we're trading with the English. The English are attacking our ships in the Atlantic because we're attacking the French. Washington's saying we're not taking sides, right? And so this is just not a good situation to be in. So one of the things that Washington did was he sent a delegation of Federalists, which is going to piss the Anti-Federalists off because none of them are there. He sends a delegation to England led by the Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, to London, right, in 1794 to try to discuss neutrality. The Jeffersonians were concerned, right, because they're like, whoa, wait a minute, right? What if we do this, right? We're going to settle into a treaty with England. France is going to get mad at us, right? So the Anti-Federalists just did not trust what was happening. So Hamilton, fearing a war with England, he actually, ahead of the arrival of John Jay, actually sent to London what the U.S.'s negotiations plan were. What? I mean, that's like treasonous stuff, right? Why would Hamilton send to England what the United States proposed to negotiate? And the reason he did it is because he wanted England to have the upper hand in negotiations to ensure that the English, right, would actually sign the treaty with the United States, what becomes known as Jay's Treaty. So the United States in 1794 signed a treaty with England, right, a neutrality agreement known as Jay's Treaty. And this is going to have enormous consequences with the Spanish. It's also going to have enormous consequences with the French. So the English United States will sign a treaty, and it avoids war. So the Jeffersonians felt the treaty was surrender to Britain, betrayal of the South, who had a lot of the debt still. Jay's Treaty gave life to the new Democratic Republican Party. So the anti-federalists become known as the Democratic Republicans. It tarnished Washington's popularity, especially in the South. Spain, fearing this new alliance with England, that the English forces and the American forces would try to somehow move west, Spain decided that the best thing to do was to be friendly with the United States. And so they signed a separate treaty called Pinckney's Treaty, which allowed the United States now to have access to the Mississippi. Now, so 1796, exhausted from diplomatic and partisan battles, Washington decided not to seek a second term as president, or third term, excuse me. And it establishes the two-term precedent, right? So 1 term equals 4 years, right? And so 2 terms would equal a total of 8 years, right? So out of respect for Washington, that's kind of the way that it ended up being, right? 2 terms. So in his farewell address, he said something really important. We're actually going to look at it in class. He advised the United States to stay out of permanent alliances with other countries, right? We needed to be really careful about alliances with other countries. And again, we'll look at it in class and we'll talk about what that means. So the next election, the election of 1796, the Democratic Republicans criticized the crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion, Jay's Treaty, and the guy who's running under the Federalist banner is John Adams. He was supported by New Englanders, businessmen, bankers, right? He defeats Thomas Jefferson. The way that it used to work, okay, was that during an election, the person who received the most electoral votes would become the prez. The person who received the second most votes would become the vice president, okay? Well, the person who received the most votes was John Adams. The person who received the second most votes, right, was Thomas Jefferson, okay? So Thomas Jefferson ends up being the vice president to John Adams. Now, initially, they are very much friends, but Adams is very much a Federalist. Jefferson is the anti-Federalist, right? And so it's going to create a lot of chaos within the presidency. The French were upset by Jay's Treaty. They saw it as a violation, right, of the French-U.S. treaty. And so they saw it as a step towards an alliance with England. So French warships began to seize U.S. merchant ships along about 300 of them by 1797. So even though we had a treaty with England, the French continued to attack us in the Atlantic Ocean. So the French refused to receive U.S. Envoy, threatened arrest. So what happened was Adams, like Washington, decided to kind of do what Washington did with Jay's Treaty, and he sent a 3-person commission, including John Marshall, who becomes the second Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He's actually a cousin of Jefferson, but again, he sends nothing but Federalists. And so the delegation reached Paris to meet with the French foreign minister, a guy by the name of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. And so they're supposed to meet with him, okay? And rather than meeting with him, they are approached by 3 go-betweeners. Later on, we find out that their names are Jean Conrad Hottinger, Lucien Hotteval, and a guy by the name of Mr. Bellamy. But because we didn't know their names at the time, they become known as Mr. X, Y, and Z. And so what happened was these 3 men demanded that the American delegation pay $250,000 just to be able to talk with Talleyrand. So the U.S. delegation was shocked because they were being disrespected, right? And so they decided to go back. They tell Adams, like, look, this is ridiculous, right? They expected us to pay, right? They should have respected us because we're a foreign nation. And so what ends up happening is, as a result of this XYZ affair, what ends up happening is we actually have what is called a quasi-war with France. for a couple years from 1798 to 1800. We have this little 2-year war, but it's called a quasi-war because there was never a war declaration. So again, the Americans wanted war, millions for defense, but not sent for tribute. So the Federalists were delighted with this quasi-war. The Jeffersonians were embarrassed by what happened. So the U.S. began to prepare for war, expanded the Navy, and then we also get the development of the Marines. So again, between 1798 and 1800, there was an undeclared war, mostly around the West Indies. The U.S. captured over 80 French ships, lost several hundreds to France. And again, France and Talleyrand did not want war, pushed U.S. to Britain. The French sent back channel message that new U.S. minister would be received properly. In 1799, Adams submitted to Senate new minister to France. And then in 1800, it is through Napoleon that we actually achieve peace. 1798, though, is really interesting. One of the things that ends up happening is the anti-French hysteria. So the Federalists began to look at the anti-Federalists, because the anti-Federalists were talking a lot of smack about them. And so what they were doing was they were writing in newspapers and they were criticizing openly. Jefferson was doing it openly about Adams, and Madison was talking smack about Adams and all the other Federalists. So in 1798, one of the things that happened was the Federalists passed what was called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what the Alien and Sedition Acts basically did was they basically said that during a time of war, right, or during a time of crises, the federal government had the right, to essentially silence its citizens because of a time of crises. So this raised this question of, well, wait a minute, can the government restrict our rights in order to create security, right? We're going to address this issue in class because it's a very important issue, right? So, and we'll talk about several examples of whether or not that's okay or not. So the Federalists wrote this law, and it was approved, it was ratified, and the idea was to essentially silence the anti-Federalists. Well, the anti-Federalists weren't happy with that, right? And, one of the last things that Benjamin Franklin, said was, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And that's going to be a quote that we'll address in class. So Jefferson and Madison, they went to Kentucky and to Virginia, and they wrote secret resolutions. And what they basically argued, was something called nullification. So they said that the states actually had the right to nullify federal law if the law was unconstitutional. So in Kentucky and Virginia, both Kentucky and Virginia state legislatures said, look, this Alien and Sedition Act, it's unconstitutional. The federal government does not have the right to silence freedom of speech of its citizens during a time of crises. And so therefore, we're not going to follow it, okay? Now, this is really an important issue because if this is true, which it's not, by the way, okay? But if this is true, then every federal law ever created, could essentially be disobeyed. So again, take today. Technically, California is nullifying federal drug law by allowing, marijuana to be used for medicinal use. But again, if the federal government really wanted to do something about it, they could, because legally they could, because it's against federal law. But this is going to be huge, because later on, the southern states are going to use this idea of nullification to say, if the federal government passes a law that bans slavery, we have the right to nullify that law. So the Federalists in 1800, when we take a look at the campaign of 1800, the Federalists ruled that the best people should be in charge. They distrusted a full-blown democracy, They said that a strong central government was important, Government should support enterprise, so business, and they were pro-British because of trade. Jefferson and the led Democratic Republicans appealed to the middle class and the underprivileged. Jefferson is called a traitor to the upper class because, again, he was from the upper class, but he opposed tyranny. So the Democratic Republicans, when we look at the election of 1800, they said weak central government, that most power should reside in the states. No special privileges for the upper class manufacturers, He actually believed that agriculture or farmers were the most important group in the country. He said, rule by the people, voting for all literate and educated. So Jefferson believed that all the people should be trusted so long as they received proper education. They believed the importance of land ownership to democracy, So they said that economic democracy should precede, right, political democracy. And basically, Jefferson's argument was that if you owned a piece of land, you would want to make sure you protect that land. And the way to protect that land is to become educated in the laws of the land. And so, therefore, if you became educated in the laws of the land, you would become an active democratic participant, right? So, land equals participation. So, Jefferson championed freedom of speech, pressed to expose misdeeds of tyranny, pro-French, right? Supported the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. Again, we'll address some of these things a little bit more in class.